Greetings and welcome. Welcome to our 2025 Cape Cod Tufts Club Winter Webinar. We're really honored you've chosen to spend a little time with us on this rather cold January evening. And indeed, as we are sure many of you would agree, the convenience of having a terrific event while in the warmth and comfort of our own homes is what makes our winter webinars really special offerings. The commute was very doable. We have a very nice audience this evening, and we hope that this webinar format will work well for you. We already have a lot of people signed in. We are beginning on time, and I assume that there will be other people who will be joining us. If you have questions for our presenter, you may enter those by simply using the Q&A feature that's located along the bottom of your Zoom screen. Yeah, it literally says Q&A. So just click on that button and then you'll be able to type your question for our wonderful presenter. Before introducing our presenter this evening, I would like to mention that the Cape Cod Tufts Club continues to be one of Tufts' most active and busy alumni groups, and we're certainly not slowing down. I'll be outlining some of the many upcoming events when I make my closing remarks after Greg Williams's presentation. So if you can just sort of hang with us at the end, I will highlight what we have coming up in the next months. One event, though, that I will mention now is that we hold our annual membership meeting and luncheon event. Many of you have already attended those in June of each year, and we will be doing so again. And at that event, we introduce 3 individuals, current Tufts students, who are receiving our Cape Cod Tufts Club scholarships. And our scholarship program is one of the cornerstones of our club's mission. And we depend entirely on the generosity of our alumni, our partners, our friends, our supporters, the people who attend our programming to fund this endeavor. So we would really like to encourage you, if you can, to visit our Cape Cod Tufts Club website, which is pretty easy to remember. I will flash the website address later, but at the end of the program. But it is basically www.capecodtuftsclub.org, not .com, but .org. Cape Cod Tufts Club, all one word, .org. Once you get to our website, it's very easy to navigate to the area where there's a link to make any donations to our scholarship fund. And it's a straightforward process, and we're so very grateful to you for your continued support and your generosity. No donation is too small, believe me. And yeah, no donation is too large. So thank you very much to our club treasurer, David Margaritas, who also continues at the helm of our scholarship committee. Now, with no further ado, because I know this is why you are joining us this evening, I'm very pleased to introduce to you our speaker for tonight, Gregory Williams. So Greg has a fascinating background. It includes a love of herpetology, British literature, history and storytelling, and the law. And after graduating from Washington and Lee University School of Law, he went into almost 20 years of private practice in Western Massachusetts and 3 years working in the Massachusetts Attorney General's office while out there. Then he was appointed an Associate Justice in 1999, starting out in Springfield before moving to an appointment that brought him to the Cape. Yay! And then in 2005, he was appointed to the position of Massachusetts District Court Judge and was the first justice of the Edgartown District Court. So on Martha's Vineyard. And he served there for 10 years, retiring in 2015. His 3 days-a-week commute to the Vineyard from his home on the Cape included traveling on the not so luxurious mail and cargo boat between Falmouth Harbor and Oak Bluffs, a trek that I'm guessing he might not miss much on frigid cold days like today. Join me now in welcoming Gregory Williams. Thank you, Greg, for being a part of this.
Thank you for inviting me to speak with you a little bit here this evening. Thanks to the Cape Cod Tufts Club and to Len Lorenzo, and now to Rebecca Stevens. What I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about one of the Cape's more colorful figures, Mad Jack Percival, and also because of the context and the adventure that is the subject of tonight. There were plenty of adventures that Mad Jack Percival had. We're going to sort of focus on one of them tonight. And given that, I want to give you a little bit of background about whaling after we do some preliminaries. I would start off by saying 36 years after the United States had declared its independence from Great Britain, it found itself in another war against Great Britain. This would come to be called the War of 1812, and fighting would last until the Treaty of Ghent in 1814. John Percival had been born on April 3rd, 1779, on Scorton Hill, West Barnstable, almost into Sandwich, in the middle of the Revolutionary War. In 1814, he was 35 years old. He was a midshipman on the USS Peacock, which was a 22-gun sloop of war, about 140 officers and men on that vessel. And off the coast of Cape Canaveral, Florida, the Peacock captured the Royal Navy ship, brig, sloop, HMS Epervier, which is the French version of Sparrowhawk. This, as you can tell from this old engraving, this was impressive. This was exciting. I'm sorry to report, though, that that triumph was not as impressive as you might think at the beginning. The Epervier was manned mostly by invalids gathered from hospitals. Most of her cannon fell from their mounts after they were fired. There was a court-martial following the year of this battle, and that court-martial concluded, among other things, that the Epervier had the worst crew of any ship of her station. Still, though, it was a victory. John Percival was a midshipman on that victorious vessel. He was promoted to lieutenant, and the midshipmen of the vessel were presented by Congress with a sword. There are not very many known photographs of John Percival, but in this one, taken 46 years after the War of 1812 ended, and also taken during the last year of his life, 1860, he posed with that sword, so it clearly meant quite a bit to him. After the War of 1812 ended, the threats of the Royal Navy, the aggression, some may say, of the Royal Navy ended. And at that point, American maritime interests were able to flourish, and they experienced, in fact, remarkable growth. One critical American maritime interest was, of course, whaling. And whaling ports such as Nantucket really burgeoned. And in fact, it was the beginning of the golden age of whaling. Thanks largely to Herman Melville, reading about whaling is fascinating. But for most of us, it's also distasteful at best. Incredibly dangerous, bloody, filthy business of killing what most people now consider to be glorious creatures. Killing them and extracting oil from their bodies is now almost unimaginable. There are some old illustrations of whales. It's unimaginable, at least in the United States, but not by much. General Motors was using sperm oil in their transmission fluid in the cars they manufactured as recently as 1972. And at this point, I should dispel some rumors that NASA used whale oil to lubricate parts on the Voyager interstellar probes, which were launched starting in 1977, and also the Hubble Space Telescope, launched in 1990. Those rumors are not true, despite what the History Channel told you in 2010. The world for most of the 19th century was lit only by fire, candles, lamps. Whale oil was the best fuel. Little odor, produced a clear and bright flame. The Industrial Revolution was exploding. Whale oil was best machine lubricant available. People on vacation, notably here on the Cape, are now search for whales in order to photograph them with their phones. But in the 19th into the early 20th centuries, men on whale ships sought whales to harvest them, to kill them. To go any further, though, I thought it would be instructive and fun to take an hour and a half or so and review the names and functions of all the sails on a whale ship. Kidding. Really, though, I do want to set out some information about whaling itself. Let's get right to whale boats themselves as opposed to whale ships or whaling ships. Whaling ships, the large vessel, carried 3 to 5 of these smaller whale boats. The whale boat was a sleek vessel, generally ranging from about 26 to 30 feet long, filled, as you can see from this illustration, with gear, including a line about 1,200 feet long. These boats were launched from the whale ship, which would position itself within a mile or two after a whale had been spotted. And by the way, a good lookout on a whale ship, he's up the mast on the ship. He could see a whale from some 5 to 6 miles away if the weather was decent. And he could identify the species of the whale by its spout. In a whaleboat like the one shown here, there'd be 6 men. The man called the boat steerer would be in the bow, and he's the man who throws the harpoon at the whale. Harpoon, generally about a 2-foot long iron shank on a 6-foot long hickory pole. He would try to stick that into the whale, probably from a distance of less than 30 feet. In this particular rendering, he's a lot closer than 30 feet. Now, if he's in the bow, why is he called the boat steerer? Because once the whale is harpooned, the boat steerer would change places with the boat header. So that person, the man in the stern of the boat, he was up to this point actually the one steering the boat. So the man in the bow, the man in the stern are changing places in the middle of this activity. It's a mystery how more people were not lost off of these whale boats during this particular maneuver. Now, once the whale is harpooned, unsurprisingly, it goes into a frenzy, and it usually tows the whale boat which has harpooned it. And the harpoon, of course, is tied to that line we mentioned earlier. This is sometimes called a Nantucket sleigh ride. And some of you may be old enough to remember the Mountain album from 1970, 1971, Nantucket sleigh ride. Anyway, harpoons in the whale, towing this whale boat, and eventually the whale becomes exhausted. And then the boat steerer maneuvers the whale boat up against the whale, and the boat header kills it by thrusting it into the whale's lungs or the large vessels under the lungs with a long lance, 5 to 6 foot long iron shank on a 5 to 6 foot long wooden pole. The ocean around the now dying whale who's engaged in a death struggle called the flurry. This would just be turned into a maelstrom of blood. Once the whale was killed, the carcass of the whale would be towed back to the waiting ship, and there the whale would be sliced up, its blubber boiled. The blubber, by the way, could be as thick as 18 inches on the whale's shoulders and back. And that blubber would be burned in order to extract the oil in a facility known as Tri-Works, which is a brick furnace just aft of the foremast, containing 2 cast iron vessels called tri-pots. The oil was then stored in casks. Most of these casks, these large barrels, were made on board, so they were not really uniform, but they held roughly 32 gallons of oil. Now, the average male sperm whale could reach 45 to 50 feet long. There were larger ones encountered who were about 60 feet long and weighing about 60 tons. 3 tons of that weight could be oil. Just for comparison's sake, 60 tons, a Type D large school bus with the kind with the flat fronts, 45 feet long, weighs about 11 tons empty. We're talking about 50, 60 tons here with a whale. The average sperm whale would yield 25 to 40 barrels of oil until the ship returned home. That was obviously in the ship being carried back to Nantucket, to Martha's Vineyard, New Bedford, New London, Sag Harbor. And these voyages, these whaleship voyages, could last between 2 and 4 years. It all depended on how many full barrels were in the hold of the ship. By that only meaningful measure, the whaleship Globe was spectacularly successful. The Globe was owned by the Quaker hegemony on Nantucket. The Globe was launched in 1815. Within 7 years, it had completed 3 highly profitable whaling voyages. In fact, on its first voyage, it became the first whale ship to return home with 2,000 barrels of oil. Thomas Worth, who was born in Edgartown, he was a lowly seaman on that first voyage, but on the Globe's 4th voyage in 1822, he would be the captain. He had married his 23-year-old sweetheart, Hannah Mayhew. Mayhew, as some of you probably know, is a venerable Martha's Vineyard name. He had married her on July 4th, 1822, apparently unconcerned that is supposed to have been Independence Day. And 5 months later, after his wedding, Worth and the Globe left Edgartown bound for the Pacific Ocean. By that time, John Percival, who had left West Barnstable when he was 13 years old to be a cabin boy on a Boston coastal trading vessel, was in the Pacific Squadron of the United States Navy. Percival had, in 1809, married Maria Fitzrandolph Pinkerton of Trenton, New Jersey. He was 30 years old. She had just turned 16. So I don't think that's the reason he was later called Mad Jack, but it couldn't have hurt. Anyway, the Pacific Squadron of the United States Navy totaled 3 vessels, and the Navy was kept busy protecting American interests on the western coast of South America, Chile, Peru, during the revolutions of Simón Bolívar. Percival served on the 3-masted 44-gun heavy frigate USS United States. He had been assigned to serve on that vessel in 1823. And I have to mention that exactly 20 years later, in 1843, Herman Melville enlisted in Honolulu on that vessel, the United States, as an ordinary seaman, and later fictionalized life on that ship in his 1850 novel, White Jack. By the time John Percival served on the United States, he was already known as Mad Jack, or even Crazy Jack, and he called himself that. He did not obtain this nickname because he diligently applied himself to paperwork. He had an explosive temper, which would peak and then decline rather rapidly, which is good for the recipient. And he was rising through the ranks of the United States Navy the hard way. He was not a, quote, gentleman with connections. His life, as I think I alluded to before, was filled with adventure. We started off by mentioning the War of 1812. That war had several causes, but one of them was the Royal Naval practice of impressment of American sailors. And among Mad Jack's early adventures was being impressed himself into the Royal Navy for 3 months until he escaped. Impressment, that practice of impressment, is how the Royal Navy mostly obtains sailors. The agents of that procedure were known as press gangs. They would essentially kidnap prospective sailors, which could involve getting the prospective sailor drunk or physically overpowering him, or both. So you're in a bar. The last thing you remember until you wake up is that you were hungover, you were beaten, and now you are on a Royal Naval vessel heading who knows where. Mad Jack Percival was impressed in 1797 when he was 19 years old onto a ship that would become one of the most famous warships in history, the Royal Naval vessel HMS Victory, which was victorious in the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Back now, though, to the Globe. It's on its fourth voyage. It needed 21 men and or boys. Worth was the captain. There were 3 mates and many of the crew from Martha's Vineyard. There was one Barnstable man, a gentleman called Paul Jarrett. And among the Vineyarders was 22-year-old boat steerer Samuel Comstock. The ages of the crew on the Globe ranged from 14 to 26, except for Captain Worth. He was the old man. He was 29. The Globe headed to an area in the Pacific Ocean known as the Japan Grounds. This was a part of the Pacific Ocean between Japan and the Sandwich Islands. The whaling vessels would go out seeking whales. They would return to the Sandwich Islands for supplies. The Sandwich Islands in probably about 1840 or so began to be referred to as Hawaii. And then we'd see a vessel on the extreme left of that picture seeking supplies. The crews on such vessels as whale ships were fluid. You would sign on for an entire voyage, the entire duration of a voyage, which, as I mentioned, ran from 2 to 4 years. But many people who signed up that way did not last the whole time. And sure enough, in Hawaii, from the Globe, 6 of the crew ran off and 1 was fired. The practice of that kind of desertion was not very rare. Melville himself did it. So that was one way that you could decide that you did not want to remain any further on a whale ship. You could desert. Another way is to band with others and mutiny. Mutiny, as you, I'm sure, know, is an extremely serious, usually a capital crime of rebellion against the authority of the ship. And we're talking about the globe, and really that's apt because a ship like that is your whole world when you're on it. And for you to commit an offense such as mutiny, very, very serious indeed, and you obviously could be hanged. Now, this boat steerer, Samuel Comstock, had probably helped some of these deserters hide in Hawaii. And he managed to be one of the people who would help select their somewhat unsavory beachcomber replacements. Silas Payne was one, William Humphreys, Joseph Thomas, and a so-called, or not so-called, but termed at that time an Indian from Barnstable or Falmouth named Anthony Hanson. Now, Samuel Comstock had served on several previous voyages. At least one of those voyages was on a whale ship. In 1822, he was among the crew on a whale ship called the Foster when it put in at Easter Island, the place, as you know, known for its monolithic human figures. Comstock, once they got ashore there, asked the captain if he could stay there, if he could stay behind when the Foster left the island. The captain refused that request. Presumably, Comstock's obsessive and racist fantasy of his ruling over native South Seas islanders as king had already been formed. And Easter Island, his Easter Island experience hardened that fantasy into a kind of obsession. At that time, Comstock was 14, energetic, often volatile. Comstock, according to almost anybody who came into contact with him, had a charismatically magnetic personality. And it's always dangerous to psychoanalyze figures in history. But one present-day analyst has described him as a prime example of a mixed personality disorder. Narcissistic, antisocial, paranoid. He certainly seems sociopathic. No regard for anyone standing in the way of his goals. In December, the Globe left Honolulu, sailing south for what was called a season on the line. But by January 1824, Captain Worth, hitherto a gentleman with a fairly even temper, had grown increasingly edgy and even violent. He threatened sailor Joseph Thomas, "If you don't respond to orders more quickly next time, I'll knock you to hell." Thomas threatened back. Worth flogged him repeatedly with the end of a line rope. The assembled crew was appalled, and Samuel Comstock, in whom this fantasy of ruling over a South Sea islands had been brewing all this time, saw his chance, and he began fueling revenge against the captain. There grew more and more discontented murmurings. The food's bad. We don't get enough time to eat the food. The captain is becoming dictatorial. That talk all increased. Whether Worth's behavior was really all that bad, who knows? But Comstock's crazed dream of becoming a South Pacific monarch saw its chance. So the following midnight, and we're in January 26th now, Comstock acted. The man at the wheel on deck was just about to sound for relief when Comstock appeared out of the dark, gave a little speech which ended with, "If you make the least damn bit of noise, I will send you to hell." A lot of sending to hell, as you can see. Now, the victim of this threat, though, was Comstock's own 17-year-old brother, George. Comstock led 4 mutineers below decks. Payne, Oliver, Humphreys, Lillison was another guy. They first headed to the captain's quarters. That was in the stern of the vessel. Captain Worth was lying in a hammock between the stern lights, trying to catch some cooling breezes. Comstock burst in there into his quarters, the captain's quarters, and hit him so hard with a hatchet that he almost took the top of Captain Worth's head off. The close quarters of below decks were not suited to the weapon that one of the other mutineers, Payne, used on the first mate of the vessel, a gentleman called Beadle. It was a boarding knife, which is a very misleading name. A boarding knife, which is the bottommost tool you see here, had a razor sharp pointed blade 4 feet long, mounted on a longer handle, as you see there. So it was kind of a clumsy fight when Payne was trying to dispatch the first mate, Beadle. Beadle fought back. He grabbed Comstock by the throat. Comstock dropped his hatchet. Payne recovered the hatchet for Comstock, who then broke Beadle's skull with it. The second and third mates by this point had locked themselves in a cabin, but by this time, Comstock and his cronies had muskets. Someone fired a shot through the door and hit one of the mates, a guy named Fisher, in the mouth. The other mate in there, Lumbert, charged out, figuring he was a fish in a barrel in those cabins, in that cabin. And he fought with Comstock and was able to get the better of Comstock. In fact, he ended up pressing a bayonet against Comstock's chest. Comstock, at that point, promised to spare Fisher. Fisher put the musket that he had recovered down. Comstock grabbed it, bayoneted Lumbert several times, and then he turned the musket on Fisher. Fisher was seriously wounded and supposedly said that if there were no hope, he would die like a man. He then turned his back on Comstock and said, "I am ready." Comstock blew out his brains from behind. Lumbert begged for his life. Comstock stabbed him repeatedly. Comstock then met his the ship's thoroughly cowed crew on deck. Beadle was brought up on deck. He was still alive. He was thrown into the ocean. And then the body of Captain Worth was thrown into the ocean, but not before someone mutilated him by shoving that boarding knife you just saw a picture of into his bowels until the point exited his throat. And then Fisher's body was thrown overboard. Lumbert was still alive, but the crew then tried to throw him over. He tried to rescue himself by catching hold of a plank, and he reminded Comstock of his promise to spare him. Comstock pushed him into the water. The Whaleship, of course, was often awash with the blood and viscera of the prey, the whale, but not in the cabins. Comstock ordered the crew to clean the cabins of human blood. Soon, a man named Humphreys became the purser of the vessel. This is a person who obtains certain supplies and tracks expenses, that kind of thing. He became the purser after the mutiny, and he was seen loading a pistol. He explained that he was doing that because he was afraid that 2 of the non-mutineers were planning to retake the ship from the mutineers. Comstock didn't buy it, and he ordered that Humphreys be put on trial, and Comstock himself would act as the prosecutor and the judge. He named 4 of the crew as a jury and had 2 other of the crew, a gentleman named Gilbert Smith, another one named Peter Kidder, to sit there. And his instructions were that if the jury convicted Humphreys, Humphreys would hang. If they acquitted Humphreys, Comstock would hang Smith and Kidder. Humphreys was guilty, mostly of being black. Probably the evidence was that Comstock was deeply racist, even by 19th century standards. So Humphreys was brought up to the deck, noose placed around his neck. Humphreys was afforded 14 seconds to make a final statement. He got a few words out, then a bell was struck, the bell you see there in this old woodcut, and he was hanged off the foreyard. Comstock made everyone hold on to and then run with the execution rope, and thereby personally made everyone hands-on complicit with the murder of this man. By February 1824, the Globe approached One Island group, but the islanders there were hostile, so they headed to Lord Mulgrave's range. This was the name then for the southeastern edge of what is now called the Marshall Islands, a chain of islands about 700 miles long. During this time, the ocean was filled with sperm whales. They were ignored. That was not the goal of Comstock. Millie Atoll is a ring of 92 islets, some of them only a few hundred yards across, around a central lagoon 25 miles across. This is about 2,300 miles southwest of Oahu. Here's a map, I think a better map. Here's a map of the Marshall Islands. And some of you might recognize some of these islands. As Eniwetok, there is Bikini, site of some atomic bomb tests. There is Kwajalein, World War II site. And Millie, you will see down sort of southwest, almost at the edge. That's where they headed. And this time, canoes approached the vessel to trade with the people on the globe. That was good. And some of those canoes were peopled by women. They were invited aboard for the night, which they did come, and finally ended up February 13th on the largest islet of this chain we just spoke about, called Millie. This is what the island chain sort of looks like. And the Marshall Islanders, this was a 19th century illustration of them. 3 days after the Globe put up on Millie, this is 3 weeks now after the mutiny, the Globe is being stripped of its supplies. And some of the crew members realized that Samuel Comstock was giving some of the islanders some of these supplies. And they figured, almost assuredly rightly, that he was doing that in order to buy their loyalty. Payne, who we referred to earlier, demanded that Comstock stop doing that. There was a confrontation. Payne stood up to Comstock. A lot of sulking going on at this point, and separate camps were created. The next morning, Comstock started to approach Payne's camp, sword in hand, and threatening them with a sword. He unfortunately brought a sword to a musket fight, so he saw the muskets in the Payne camp, started waving his hands, promised not to hurt anybody over there, and we already know what that was worth. Payne probably remembered Lumbert's pleas during the mutiny and Comstock's promise of mercy toward him. 2 shots were fired at Comstock. One hit him in the chest, another hit him in the head. And to ensure that Comstock was really and truly dead, out came the hatchet again. The kingdom that Comstock had envisioned and dreamt about for years never got going at all. Payne now became the de facto leader of the Globe crew members. He sent 6 crew members aboard the Globe. These were men who were sort of on the fringes of the mutiny, including Hanson from Barnstable or Falmouth, and Comstock's younger brother, George. That night, those 6 crew members loosed the cable and the Globe drifted away from Milli Milli. That left 9 crew members on the island. The Globe carried limited supplies, and the 6 crew members on the Globe who decided to let it drift away from Milli Milli were pretty inexperienced navigators. One of them, Gilbert Smith, who I mentioned earlier, knew most. The coast of South America was about 7,000 miles away. But I guess the thinking was that it's hard to miss the coast of South America. And after 109 days, June 1824, 6 months after the mutiny, the Globe arrived in Valparaiso, Chile. By late October, the story, always characterized as mutiny and murder, had appeared in the Boston newspapers. The Globe herself arrived in Edgartown in November of 1824, and great outrage obviously followed. The Nantucket whaleship fleet owners, the Martha's Vineyard whaleship fleet owners demanded action. This mutiny cannot go unaddressed. They petitioned President Monroe in January 1825 to do something about this. Now, from 1800 to 1850, there were about 7,000 whaleship departures from the east coast of the U.S. There were 16 mutinies, only 2 of them before 1825. A few of those resulted in anyone's death. There was only one with multiple murders, this one. Now, I already mentioned the vessels Peacock and the frigate United States. Those 2 ships were 2/3 of the United States Naval Pacific Squadron. The 3rd ship was the smallest of the 3. It was called the Dolphin. It was an 88-foot-long sloop of war, 12 guns, crew of about 67. That vessel, the Dolphin, left Peru in August of 1825, Mad Jack Percival commanding. He was 46 years old at that time. Mad Jack's mission was to ascertain if there were any of these mutineers still out there in the South Pacific, on the atoll that they had now learned about. And if so, capture them. And from there, go on to the Sandwich Islands / Hawaii to determine the state of things there. Mostly to learn whether American vessels were enjoying the same trade status as other nations. Also, islanders there owed some American creditors some money for some sandalwood, and they wanted to learn the intentions of that being paid. And of course, just to show the flag. The vessel on the way out stopped for provisions, had a number of encounters with islanders, many of them hostile. Several of them involved gunfire and even cannon fire. But in November of 1825, the Dolphin reached Milli. And now there ensued a kind of tense game between Percival and his men on the one hand and the Milli Islanders on the other. It developed that there were 2 survivors from the Globe, and the Islanders hid them, probably mainly because of their fear that if the Navy found out that they, the Islanders, had killed the other crew members, retribution would surely rain down upon them. The search began. through the whole island group there for the two survivors that the Peacock crew members now believed were what they were going to find. They found a whale lance, which was evidence that the ship had indeed been there. They found pieces of a spar, and they finally found what seemed to be a grave, and indeed it was, because there was a skeleton, and they somehow figured out that that was Comstock. And then comes the climax of the tale on Millie. Lieutenant Hiram Paulding, some crew members of the Dolphin, were in a small boat searching along the shore of these islets, and they came upon a man on the beach about 40 yards away from them. This man was deeply tanned, had his hair knotted on his head, which I kind of envy, and he was wearing a loincloth. About 40 yards behind him stood hundreds of armed islanders. And this guy, the one with the top knot, yelled at Paulding, "The Indians are going to kill you. Don't come on shore unless you are prepared to fight." Indians, 19th century catch-all phrase, I guess, for anybody such as these Pacific Islanders. The gentleman on the beach said he had convinced the Islanders that he was setting a trap for the Peacock's crew members, that he would lure these sailors onto the shore, enabling the Islanders to then kill them. Paulding told him to run, and he replied that they would kill him with stones before he could reach Paulding's boat. And then, in a maneuver that one writer has observed displayed that Paulding was the true disciple of Mad Jack Percival, Paulding brought the boat ashore, ran to the man, grabbed him with one hand while he was holding a pistol in the other. And Paulding asked him to confirm who he was. He said, "I am your man." And then he exploded into tears. He was delirious with joy. He was 18-year-old William Lay. Now the Islanders began to approach, threatening to overwhelm these sailors. And Paulding told Lay to warn them that if they advanced any further, they would all be shot. Not clear precisely how that was going to happen, but it did work. They retreated, except for one old man who approached Lay and hugged him. Lay told Paulding that this man was his benefactor. Lay was in debt to him for his life. He was essentially adopted by this gentleman. And when you read Paulding's journal, which I have here, he describes this whole thing in the driest possible way, but I figure he probably said something along the lines of, "It's great. That's a very touching story. He's a wonderful man, wonderful story. Let's get the hell out of here." They got into the boat and cast off. Lay told Paulding that everyone from the globe was dead. Some of them had been killed by spears, others had been killed by stones, except for another crew member named Cyrus Hussey, who was about 20. He was on an island a few miles away. And like Lay, he had been adopted, in essence, by an island family. Hussey was rescued, not quite as dramatically, but still enough to send him into shock. And it developed that the two had been on Millie for a year and 9 months. They were taken back to the Peacock, and on that ship, Mad Jack Percival feelingly shook them by the hand with tears of sympathy for their trying scenes and hardships. I remember that Mad Jack's orders were to go on from this mission to assess the situation in Hawaii. Hawaii then was a monarchy. American missionaries had been at work there since about 1820. In the words of one historian, the American missionaries, and many of them from Massachusetts, New York, were strict Calvinists who regarded the islands as an unspoiled wilderness filled with pliable heathens. Mad Jack, during his time in Hawaii, there with the Dolphin, engaged in various clashes with the population there, mostly with the missionaries, and they form a colorful story on their own. That is Mad Jack's adventures and the adventures of his crew there on Hawaii. Perhaps one of the best sources on this whole Hawaiian episode is this article, U.S. Navy Captain Mad Jack Percival and the Naked Wahinis, the Hawaii story James Michener didn't tell. Wahinis, as many of you probably know, means women. So, naked women. This was printed in this periodical Man's magazine, and that scholarly monograph is available in any men's barbershop in 1959. The Dolphin had arrived in Hawaii in January of 1826, stayed there about 5 months. It was supposed to have been gone from its port in South America for 6 months total, but was away for more than a year. In 1837, Nathaniel Hawthorne, this is not Nathaniel Hawthorne, this is Mad Jack again. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Scarlet Letter, House of Seven Gables, My Kinsman Major Molyneux. He was about 33 years old, and he visited the Charlestown Navy Yard. And while he was there, he was delighted to learn that its commander, Mad Jack Percival, was there. And Mad Jack was asked to join Hawthorne and his host captain, and he did so. And this is Hawthorne's description of Mad Jack. Shortly down comes old Captain Percival, a white-haired, thin-visaged, weather-worn old gentleman. There was an eccentric expression in his face, which seemed partly willful, partly natural. He seems to have molded and shaped himself to his own whims, till a sort of rough affectation has become thoroughly imbued throughout a kindly nature. Percival seems to be the very pattern of old integrity, taking as much care of Uncle Sam's interests as if all the money expended were to come out of his own pocket. He seems to have no ambition beyond his present duties, perhaps never had any. At any rate, he now passes his life with a sort of gruff contentedness, grumbling and growling, yet in good humor enough. He is conscious of his peculiarities, for when I asked him whether it would be well to make a naval officer Secretary of the Navy, he said, God forbid, for that an old sailor was always full of prejudices and stubborn whim-whams, instancing himself, whereto I agreed. Now, Hawthorne's description of Mad Jack Percival might make you picture a barnacle-encrusted relic from ancient days of seafaring, finally put out to watery pasture. But Percival was only 58 years old when Hawthorne met him. And in fact, John Percival went on to other adventures, including when he was 65 years old, circumnavigating the world. Either 52,279 miles or 52,370.5 miles in 1844, 1845 on Old Ironsides, the USS Constitution. On that voyage, he carried an oak coffin in the cabin, just in case. The Constitution is berthed at the old Charlestown Navy Yard. It's the oldest commissioned naval vessel afloat. You'll recall that John Percival, as a youth, had been impressed upon the HMS Victory. That is the oldest commissioned naval vessel, but it is in dry dock. When you visit the Victory in Portsmouth in England, you must be accompanied by Royal Naval personnel. And there are no photographs allowed on board the vessel. Apparently, the Royal Navy does not want any technological naval secrets leaked to the French. And another thing I can tell you about the HMS Victory is even though you are warned when you're below decks to be very, very conscious and aware of how low the roof is, you can hit your head very hard on a beam below decks. John Percival died September 7th, 1862 during the Civil War, 10 days before the Battle of Antietam, which is usually described as the bloodiest day in American history. He was 83 years old. He died at home in a place known as the Percival Cottage, which was in Dorchester. There is now there a Percival Street. You might wonder why you have not heard the term admiral in connection with Mad Jack Percival. He was a captain. That was the highest rank in the Navy at the time. The first U.S. naval admirals were named 2 months before Jack Percival died. Percival was brought back to West Barnstable, and he lay in state in a building now known as the 1717 Meeting House, West Parish Congregational Church. Some people call it the Rooster Church. He was in his full uniform, in his rosewood casket. He, as far as is known, he was the only person ever to lay in state in that building. Now, 10 years earlier, in 1852, that church, which had originally been constructed in 1717, 1719, had been completely renovated from its original meeting house configuration into a typical New England neoclassical church, as depicted here. 100 years after that, the church was restored to its original early 18th century form. Mad Jack's body was taken to the old West Barnstable Cemetery, which is at the corner of Route 6A and Route 149, Meeting House Way. Marble gravestones don't last like slate, so his gravesite and his wife Maria's headstone. She had died 6 years before Mad Jack did at the age of 64. Those marble gravestones were replaced by the town of Barnstable in 1964. Part of the wall on the Route 6A side of the cemetery was paid for by money from the Percival estate. There is a memorial marker there in the wall, which you have probably seen if you've driven that stretch of Route 6A. This marker notes Mad Jack's circumnavigation in the Constitution, but there is nothing there among his many other adventures about that voyage, about another voyage, which might have been the Western world's first armed incursion into what is now Vietnam. There's nothing about naked Wahinis on there, and nothing about Mad Jack's role in the aftermath of the bloodiest whaleship mutiny in American history. So that's the end, and I thank you for your attention. And now something else is going to happen. There's Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Greg, for your outstanding presentation.
Thanks,
The
Rebecca.
amount of research that you have committed to this is extraordinary, and I can imagine the discovery had to have been a fascinating journey, hopefully with no mutinies involved.
It's been a while. It's been a while.
Very, very interesting to hear about this history of one of Cape Cod's native sons.
Yes.
And just thank you so much for the interesting presentation with all of the visuals that you had, making it, come to life in our minds. So I'm sure I'm joined by all of our attendees in thanking you for sharing this interesting presentation about Mad Jack Percival and the happenings on the ship the Globe, and involving all of his endeavors.
Thank you.
Some prettier than others, no doubt.
Yes, yes.
And yes,
I was just going to say, it looks like some questions are popping up.
great. Remember, folks, just type into the Q&A any questions that you have for Greg.
The questions are popping up. Whether any answers will pop up, that's an open question. But the first one comes from a gentleman named Dan, who asks, how did Mad Jack escape after being impressed in the British Navy? And I'm not sure I can answer that one. I'm not sure anybody really knows the details of that, although I seem to remember having read it at some point. I just don't remember. The next entry is Dave says, fascinating, thanks. Thank you, Dave. I appreciate it. How old was Samuel Comstock when he died? Trying to think. I think he was about 22 or so. He was young. Might have been a couple of years older than that, but early 20s. Captain Worth was the oldest guy on the ship. Any descendants of the captain still on the Cape? I don't know of any descendants of his. I can tell you that his name still lives around here, even beyond the cemetery where he's buried. There are a couple of places called Percival. There's a Percival Street, or Percival Road, I should say, which I think is in West Barnstable. There is a very, very small cemetery on the road, the main road near where I live, called the Percival Cemetery, and there's a Percival dwelling there, a house called Percival. That's the address. Descendants, I don't know of any. Interesting that you would ask that, though, because I obviously talk about other people with ties to the Cape. Some other Cape favorite sons. William Sturgis is one of them. Chief Justice Lemuel Shaw. And when you give talks on the Cape, probably anywhere in New England, you have to be very careful what you say, because sure enough, there might well be someone connected to the subject of your talk if they are not related to them. So it's an issue. Percival's, I don't know any of such descendants. Looked like another one popped up, but I don't. Thank you. Great lecture. Why is whaling still allowed? Whaling generally is outlawed by various agreements, but whaling is still allowed in the waters off Japan. They still kill whales. In fact, one of the last times I gave this talk, a year or two ago, probably 2 years by now, they were building a huge whaling vessel in order to, quote, harvest, unquote, whales. Obviously, still too, there are various indigenous people who are allowed to hunt whales, the same way they're allowed to fish and that kind of thing. But yeah, it's kind of nasty. By the way, while we're talking about whaling and maybe some of the more distasteful aspects of it, but also some of the aesthetics of it, if you have never been to the New Bedford Whaling Museum, I would suggest you go. It is just a fabulously run museum, very, very interesting, with, among other things, a half-scale model of a whaling vessel built in the early part of the 20th century called the Lagoda. The next question was, are you familiar with his connection to the Bursley, quote, boys of West Barnstable? No, but I will certainly find that out. Is there another one? Let's see. I'm seeing 6 here. Magic, fascinating home, descendants. Thank you. Are you familiar with this connection? I guess that's 6. So maybe that's it. I don't know. Good questions. Always asking the ones I don't know the hard answers to, but that's okay. I think that's it, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for the questions that you entered.
Yes.
And certainly to all of today's attendees, thank you again for being a part of our Cape Cod Tufts Club winter webinar program. We're
My
so
thanks
grateful.
too.
We're so grateful to Greg Williams for being here and being so generous with his time and his stories and sharing them with us.
My pleasure.
Before we bid adieu, I just want to mention that next up will be our spring event, which will be right around the corner on the other side of all the cold weather, hopefully. And that's going to be a guided tour of the Whydah Pirate Museum in Yarmouth, followed by an early dinner at Captain Parker's restaurant, located adjacent to the museum. Keeping the theme going here with maritime adventures, right? This will be,
Black Sam Bellamy.
yeah, exactly. This will be on the afternoon and evening of Friday, April 18th. So mark your calendars for Friday, April 18th, and the tour will begin at 3:30. You're going to be able to register for either just the museum visit, or you may register for both the museum and the dinner. So we're doing it a little differently. You will receive more information via email from Tiffany White in our Tufts alumni office. And by the way, if you are not on our email list, but you want to be notified of our events, don't worry, you're not going to get a bunch of junk email. You're only going to receive the events emails. And all you have to do is email Tiffany and ask her to be added to the Cape Cod Tufts Club email list, and you'll be added. You don't even have to be a Tufts alum to enjoy our programs. Just let her know. And again, Ryan's going to put up a screen that will give her email address. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to have our annual meeting and luncheon in June, at which the scholarships are awarded, and we'll have a speaker. And then on August the 20th, as we begin to close out the summer, but we're pleased to again be able to host our annual Cocktails by the Sea reception at the Hyannis Yacht Club, a really popular event. So when you see the email for that, register ASAP if you want to be able to attend. And then in December, we'll have our reserved block of seats for the Cape Cod Symphony Orchestra's holiday program. So the information about all of our events, like I said, will be emailed to you if you're already on our list. And if you're not, keep an eye, email Tiffany, and then everybody keep an eye on your emails for these important ones that come from Tiffany White. Thank you to Lynn DeLorenzo, our Vice President and Event Organizer Extraordinaire. Also, thank you to Tiffany White and Ryan Colantolio and Andy Colbert at Tufts. They are the techies who have been leading us through this so masterfully, and your help is so appreciated.
Yes.
Best wishes to everyone. And Ryan, you can go on and put that screen up if you would with the contact information. And we hope to see you at some of our other events in the next months to come. Best wishes to you for a great evening and weekend.
Thanks again.